buzzwords like
I
cyber.
looked at that article, and I didn't think some of them were really valid, just called buzzwords. I mean, threat intelligence, I think it's a valid concept.
Oh yeah, a lot of them are valid concepts. It's just people don't use them right.
Is cybersecurity one word and a capital S, or is there a break in it? I've seen it like 15 different ways.
Yeah. One, I've seen it. My little pet peeve with cyber security is that people use it to refer to information security, right, which is different. Cyber, if you look up cyber, it's technical.
But online it says government intelligence.
Government intelligence. So, are they seeing anything on mine?
Not yet. You can share your screen and turn on your webcam.
Yeah. So I'm showing screen.
I see the wrong screen. There you go.
Screen.
There we go.
Webcam. Undo. We're in business.
There we go.
Are we in business now?
We're in business.
All right. You can see that. All right, let's keep going. All right, so this answer right here, somebody validated in the book, this is actually D. So I got one wrong. I think that's still 75%. I still passed. Still an expert. Which I think is kind of a cool thing, because when you go through the exam, you know, and I think you went over it in the first class, there'll be some experimental questions. There'll be questions you've never seen before. Don't freak out about it. It might be one of those experimental questions. So if you get one wrong, you just don't have any clue.
Just have no idea.
Just keep going. All right, so this is where we left off. We talked about kind of the history of cryptography. There are some good movies, and I got some good links, some good recommendations for books. I think some people gave me some good recommendations online. I'm actually gonna buy one of those, because I think it's really, except for it's like freaking 900 pages. Like a 90-page book is kind of more my style. But anyway, really cool history of encryption stuff. Now we're going to get into the types of cryptography, really only 3 types that we're going to focus on: symmetric, asymmetric, and hashing, right? And so we're going to go into some symmetric encryption algorithms. We're not going to go deep into them. We don't have to be math experts, but just know when I would use them and how they work, and why I would use a symmetric algorithm versus an asymmetric algorithm. You know, you mentioned something like AES. Is that symmetric or asymmetric? You know, those types of kind of basics is what we're going to go through, and that's what you're going to need for the exam. Asymmetric algorithms called public key cryptography. We'll go through all that stuff. That's the types of cryptography. The cryptographic attacks. What's a cryptographic attack? Do you remember the word for that? Cryptanalysis is the word for, you know, attacking cryptography. We'll go through some basic cryptographic attacks. There might be a question on the exam for that. Implementing cryptography gets a little more kind of detailed. Here we'll talk about, you know, things like IPSec. We'll talk about public key cryptography, PKI, you know, and all that stuff. We'll get through that as quickly as we can, and then we'll get into physical security. Physical security, we're going to start with perimeter defense. When we look at physical security, so that's part of what we assess here. When we assess information security, it's administrative, physical, and technical controls, right? So physical security is a key component of information security. And when we look at physical security, we're looking for that defense in depth. It starts at the site selection, right? Then it starts about the building itself, the perimeter defenses. And then if an intruder did get into the perimeter, what additional controls do we have before they get to kind of, you know, some of our key assets? We'll talk about all that stuff, and then we'll get into some technical things, or not really technical, but detailed stuff that you'll have to memorize. You know, fire suppression is a big thing that'll be on the test. You know, CCTV, some things like that. And then anyway, and I'll show you some pictures from some of the places that we've been that are kind of like funny. Like, who does this? People do it. So starting on page 160, if you're in the book, starting with symmetric encryption. So the difference between symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric encryption, the key, one of the big key differences is symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt. It's just one key. Now the challenge, and it's high performance, it's better performance than asymmetric encryption. The big thing about the challenge though is how do I get you the key, right? And that's where asymmetric encryption can help us. Asymmetric encryption uses one key to encrypt and a related key, but not the same key, to decrypt, right? It's called a key pair. private key, public key. Private key would be one that I would use to encrypt, and anybody with my public key would be able to decrypt that. So if you were able to decrypt something that I had encrypted with the private key, it sort of proves, assuming that I kept that key secret, it sort of proves that you got it from me too, right? And so we start getting into some non-repudiation stuff. Now, if you encrypt something with the public key, my public key, I'm the only one who can decrypt it. So now we've got some confidentiality. And when you get this going both ways, now we've got confidentiality and non-repudiation in our communications. That's asymmetric encryption. Oftentimes what you'll see in practice is we use asymmetric encryption to set up a secure channel to transfer a symmetric key, and then the rest of our communications will take place with the symmetric key because it's better performance and it's stronger. That's what usually happens. So here in symmetric encryption, also called secret key encryption, faster, stronger per bit of key, so it means the length of the key. The major weakness, like I said, is getting you the key. It's either out of band, or we're going to have to figure out something like a DiffieHellman, a key exchange protocol, or something to get the key to you securely. Keys are often shared via out-of-band method. There's two types of ciphers, two primary types of ciphers for symmetric key, and it's just how it operates on the plain text to create the ciphertext determines what kind you're using. Stream and block. Block works in chunks of data at a time. Stream works on each bit of data at a time. It gets a little more confusing because some symmetric encryption algorithms will work in what's called stream mode. It's still a block cipher, but it's working just one bit blocks, right? You don't have to worry about that. Just understand that difference between stream and block. It becomes a lot more important when we get into the different types of like DES, because some work in block, some work in stream mode. But anyway, stream ciphers, block ciphers. A stream, each bit independently is encrypted and operated on. Block is chunks of data are operated on. DES, its default mode works on 56-bit blocks. It encrypts 56 blocks at a time. That's a block cipher. But we'll get into all that stuff. 128, 192, AES can work in both modes. Stream block is probably most common. And then there's that emulation, between block and cipher. Does that make sense? Any questions? This is just the basics that you'll just need to memorize if it doesn't make sense. You're not going to, most of us are not mathematics wizards, and we're not creating our own encryption algorithms. We're not breaking down, and reading the actual Rindell cipher, which is the AES. We're not, if you do, that's totally different.
From what I remember is you'll need to know, like AES has 128 blocks. What are the key options? 128, 192, 256. How many rounds? 10, 12, 14. So they're going to give you these parameters, and you need to know what are they talking about.
Yep.
It's just rote memorization.
It really is. So an initialization vector, what that's used for, it's random data that gets added at the beginning of the encryption process. Because in some cases, if we don't use an initialization vector, two plaintexts will encrypt to the same ciphertext if using the same key, right? Which helps a cryptanalysis to break that encryption. So you add an initialization vector. Sometimes it's just called IV, which is random. That means what would result then would be two completely different ciphertexts with the same plaintext with the same key and the same algorithm. Does that make sense? So it's just to differentiate the two. And where this plays a big role is, letters, emails. People typically start emails the same way, start letters the same way. And so you can start, your cryptanalysis already knowing a certain part of the text potentially. Just makes it easier. So initialization vector breaks that up. Chaining is taking a block or a stream of previous ciphertext and using that in the next round of ciphertext. And you would do that because it really helps with diffusion. It really spreads the bits out. Remember what diffusion is? We have diffusion and confusion. Confusion is just randomizing the data. Diffusion is really spreading it out amongst the cipher or the ciphertext. So we would use chaining, sometimes called feedback. Now it's called feedback only in stream mode. So there's a key right there. If you hear, cipher feedback, that's a stream mode cipher. right? Because it's using the word feedback versus the word chaining. So, key in on, the difference between, key in on the word feedback and chaining, because it'll tell you what mode the the algorithm is working in. Does that make sense? So chaining, it's called feedback in stream modes, takes previously encrypted text and then diffuses it or, uses it in the next block of encryption.
Question.
Yeah.
So I'm probably just getting thick-headed today, but it's two messages that begin the same one, the same way after the first one.
Yep.
So the initialization vector is saying, so if all of your messages are set up so that, like an email, and to so-and-so, from so-and-so, and here's the subject, so there's common characters in there, so the initialization vector throws some random pre in there.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So, but I'm struggling with the two messages that begin the same way, will encrypt the same way, because isn't that what
It'll encrypt that part of the message, that part of the ciphertext will encrypt the same way.
Without the initialization vector?
Without the initialization vector.
Okay.
Yep. Add the initialization vector to randomize that front part. Yep.
I thought I was saying as a result, and I'm going up there, I think it should be the opposite.
It is the opposite. Did I write it wrong up here?
No, it's just the way my brain is.
Okay.
How is a round defined when we're talking about number of rounds?
We're going to get to that.
So there you go.
But different ciphers work on different rounds. So how many times they're going to go through this thing. Like DES just goes through essentially once, right? But then, triple DES goes once, back, and once again using different keys. Either 2 triple DES or 3 triple DES, whatever. But we'll get to that, the rounds.
Okay.
So DES is the first one that we'll go through because DES was kind of the grandfather. It was kind of the first widely used, commercially used encryption standard. All encryption standards, so when you see the S, right, because the advanced encryption standard isn't actually the advanced encryption standard algorithm. It's the Rindell algorithm. It's the standard because the NIST conducted a competition, and that's the one that was chosen to become the standard. Okay. DES is the same way. DES is the data encryption standard prior to our current advanced encryption standard. It's actually the Lucifer cipher. Sounds all kind of scary and stuff, but it was developed by IBM. It's the Lucifer cipher that was accepted by the NIST to become the data encryption standard. 64-bit block size, but 56-bit key. I think I had that wrong before. I think I said it was a 56-bit block, a 64-bit key. It's actually the other way. 64-bit block and a 56-bit key for data encryption. Now there are other DES implementations that use 112-bit keys, but the standard DES uses a 56-bit key. Different modes, so we'll need to know these modes. There are 5 modes, so you can already see the modes that DES can operate in. This is from oldest to latest, right? So the original mode for DES was electronic codebook, not very secure. That's easily cracked. They're actually all somewhat easily cracked now. But you can see where you've got chaining and feedback, right? So there's our key. I know that because those two, cipher block chaining and cipher feedback, operate essentially the same way. The only difference is one operates in stream mode and the other operates in block mode, right? You know which one's for block mode because chaining, right? Chaining is block, feedback is streaming. So those are the difference between those two. What will be testable is, so each one of these each one of these modes is taking ciphertext and feedback or chaining into another block of plain text, then becoming ciphertext. To make it stronger, right? And also to take randomization out of the equation and other things. The things that will be important, I'm going to show you, after we get through this, a table. Because the differentiators between these are essentially, the number one is, do errors propagate? There's an error in the first block of ciphertext. Will it propagate through the rest and destroy the integrity of the entire data set? but we'll get into that. Electronic codebook is the original mode of DES. The others were added. There's a FIPS publication. FIPS stands for Federal Information Processing Standard. If you want to know more about it, I don't know why you would, but you can click on that link and that'll give you FIPS 61. It's also, the counter mode is the latest mode, but none of these are approved anymore. But if you want to see the special publication for the use of that, it's there. And again, these are all only commercial, non-classified data, right? So these are not Federal Information Processing Standards for classified data. That isn't part of the test. So here's the first electronic codebook. Now it's a little bit hard to see, how it works, but it's essentially just taking what was previously encrypted as is and putting it into the next round of ciphertext. No initialization vector, so we have no randomization of at all. So, we're still susceptible then to that, the frequency analysis of message beginnings. Simplest, weakest form, identical plain text with identical keys will encrypt to identical ciphertext, which is nice for cryptanalysis because you keep playing around with and look for differentiate. And that's how it was cracked. You would just change specific things in the message and then see what the resulting ciphertext was and then work your way backwards and just do that over and over and over again, and eventually you'll get it. So cipher block chaining, this is a block mode. Now we've added an initialization vector. You can see, it's hard to see on the screen, but it's the same. The reason why it's chaining here is to destroy patterns to make it cryptanalysis that much more difficult. We've added an initialization vector, but there's nothing else added. And so this means that an encryption error in any one block will propagate into other future blocks, destroying everything. Yeah, that's the important thing to remember about cipher block chaining. You'll never ever use it, but you'll need to memorize it for the test. Because you'll never use, well, you probably will never use DES, I assume. Cipher feedback works the same way as cipher block chaining. The only difference is that we're working now in stream mode. It works, everything else works the same way. Still destroying patterns, still using the initialization vector, errors will propagate to the rest of the ciphertext. Output feedback is a little bit different. Now our errors will not propagate because we've added, they're now sort of independent, and there's error checking involved, through each round of ciphertext. So previous ciphertext still used for feedback. That's to destroy the patterns. XORed into the plaintext. Remember the XOR? Do you remember the truth table that I showed you? If 2 bits are the same, what's the result? 0 or 1. 0?
0.
0. So if it's 0, 0, it'll be 0. If it's 1, 1, it'll be 0. If it's 0, 1, it'll be 1. If it's 1, 0, it'll be 1. Right? That's our XOR table if you wanted to write it down. But that's how it's running that same thing bit by bit. We have a sub key before it's XORed into a plain key. The sub key is what keeps our plain text, or keeps the errors from not propagating. The things to remember about output feedback is that it's working in stream mode. Initialization vectors are used, and errors do not propagate. If you remember those 3 things about this mode, you'll be fine. But there's a picture there to help in your studies too. And like I said, I'm going to get to a table where it's all laid out, so you don't have to memorize all this other stuff if you don't want to. This is so this one uses a counter instead of, this one used the sub key. This one uses a counter. They work essentially the same way. The output feedback, and the output feedback, cipher feedback and cipher block chaining work essentially the same way. Output feedback introduces a sub key, which then errors don't propagate. Counter mode works essentially the same way, but we're using a counter instead of a sub key. Right? It's the fastest mode and the most secure mode. Because when I'm using a counter, I'm not waiting for a sub key to be calculated. So if I use a counter, I can actually encrypt in parallel. So I can have multiple threads or multiple processes encrypting data at the same time. So it is the fastest mode. Here's what you need to remember. Right? So this will be the slide that you'll want to memorize. If you want to go through the other slides just to kind of help you refresh, what we've talked about, that's fine, but this is the one you want to remember. So you've got the 5 modes there. What type are they? You can see the feedbacks are streams, the chaining are block modes, initialization vector, do they use them or not, and error propagation. Does it propagate or not? Okay? Sound fun? Memorize that. All right, so single DES. This was the original implementation of DES, just one time through the encryption algorithm. 64-bit blocks again, 56-bit key. The work factor, remember we talked about work factor, was reasonable in 1976. What they call AES today is computationally infeasible. I was talking to a guy who does quantum computing today. It was kind of interesting. He thinks that you talk to different people and they say different things, but he thinks that advanced encryption standard will be breakable using quantum computing in a relatively short period of time. That differs considerably from other quantum computing experts who think we're a decade or more away from that. Like some are even saying 20 years out. So I just thought that was interesting because I just had that communication with him today because he was up there touting how his product that he was selling. What's that?
Yeah.
Well, exactly, and that's why I challenged him. I was like, really? I mean, because they don't work the same way. Quantum computing uses like quantum physics, like ripples in the water, kind of. I mean, really deep stuff. Whereas we're talking ones and zeros here. You know, quantum computers don't work that way. So it was interesting. Yeah, I did learn some stuff. Copacabana was, I don't think Copacabana itself as a name will be testable, but that's where it was originally cracked, and it took a while, took a week. Now it's hours, you know. It's much faster. With your cell phone. But there's a place, if you ever want to crack some DES, there you go. There's a website that you can do it with. That's not testable either. I just thought it was interesting. You know, if you ever wanted to crack some encryption, you can do it. If you can find DES anymore, I don't know who'd be using it. If they do use it, they deserve it to be cracked, probably.
That hasn't been approved for use for
years, right? So triple DES works essentially the same way. It does work the same way as DES. It's just how we're using the DES, you know, how many times we're using it and how we're using it. So 3 times per block. Became the recommended standard in 1999. It's FIPS 46-3 if you want to read it. You don't have to read it. It is slow because DES itself is slow, and now I got to do it 3 times. And it is more complex than AES and 2FISH. AES and 2FISH. AES, they just renamed Rindell because it won the competition as AES. 2FISH was also in that competition. 2FISH was one that was created by Bruce Schneier. And that's open, and you can go use 2FISH too. There's nothing stopping you from using that. Now, double DES, the reason why we went from just DES to triple DES is because double DES essentially it's just whatever the work factor was, basically times 2. Because you can attack cryptanalysis, you know, in both directions. It's a meet in the middle attack. So there's FIPS 46-3 if you're interested. You don't have to do anything with it if you don't want. 3 times per block again. Did I just go through this? No. Okay. So different types of encrypt, decrypt, encrypt, right? So if I do so if you just kind of think this through, if I just do 1 key, so that's what the 1 key DES, EDE means. It's 1 triple DES, encrypt, decrypt, encrypt. So what do I end up with? Single DES, right? If I'm using 1 key EDE, I just encrypted it because it's 1 key. I encrypt it with that key, decrypt it with that key, and then encrypt it with that key. So that doesn't make any sense. Two keys, triple DES, EDE, encrypt with one, decrypt with another, and encrypt with another. There's some additional security there, and then 3 key triple DES is encrypt, decrypt, encrypt is kind of the de facto. It's when people were using triple DES. So anyway, that's 112-bit keys. If you're using 2 keys, anyway, that's just an explanation of it all. What you need to remember is the 1 TDES EDE, 2 TDES EDE, right? 1 key, 2 key, 3 keys. Why we don't use 1 key triple DES, because it's the same as DES. Yeah, that's good enough. And here's some just an example. So there's single DES encryption. There's triple DES encryption with one key. So an encrypt looks the same. A decrypt, and an encrypt looks the same. Just driving home that point, right? IDEA is still another encryption algorithm. The thing to remember about IDEA is it is a symmetric key encryption algorithm. It is a 128-bit key, 64-bit block size, but IDEA is proprietary. It's patented in some places. It's not an open algorithm. You can't go and scrutinize. So do you remember the name of the principle that violates? It'll be on the test, the Kirchhoff principle. So the Kirchhoff principle says that the security of the encryption has nothing to do with the secrecy of the encryption algorithm. That's the Kirchhoff principle. So this would be, essentially a violation of that. Patent encumbrance and slower speed. It is slower than Rindell. The advanced encryption standard, this is the current standard today. There's the FIPS number, FIPS 197 if you want to read it. 128-bit key. So this is what he was saying, that is something, if you were going to take that third bullet point, this is what he was saying, is a potential thing that he's seen on the test. 128-bit key means 10 rounds. 192-bit key means 12 rounds. That's how many times it's going to run through the encryption algorithm. 256-bit key, 14 rounds. Okay, so that's one to highlight and to memorize. Open question?
No, I was agreeing with you.
You were agreeing with me. Okay.
Yes, memorize.
It's because we're like unicorns and stuff. Well, you are. Open algorithm, free to use, free of intellectual property, so it's completely open. No violation of the Kirchhoff principle. And AST, this is how the process went, essentially, and understanding how the process went, I think, is good information. They went out, it wasn't long after DES was kind of, you knew that DES was going to be sunsetted soon. I don't know if it was after, yes, okay, so DES was broken, then triple DES. There was kind of a rush to get triple DES as kind of a stopgap between DES and AES. But at that point, that's when they kind of started the whole AES competition. So they solicited input. 15 candidates were announced. The list was reduced to 5. These are the 5. Rindell was chosen and became the AES standard. You can see the others. So Mars, IBM is back in the game. They had 11 authors there. RSA is Ravesh, Shamir, and Adelman. That's the same RSA that has the conference every year, and it's the same RSA. A couple of those are in the information. There's an Information Security Hall of Fame. Did you know that? Yeah, a couple, either all 3 or at least 2 of them are in that. What's that?
Nobody knows where it is. Nobody knows where it is.
Yeah, I don't. But I know Whitfield Diffie is in it. He's part of the DiffieHellman. Anyway, there's Rindell. So knowing the encryption algorithms, knowing the names of the people who invented it is not important. That won't be on the exam. But you can see Bruce Schneier there on the last one, the 2 fish. And all these, you can use all these today. There are products that will implement these.
They will ask about, with all of these on there, you need to know which one is correct.
And you'll need to know that these are symmetric key encryption algorithms, right? Because they might list out a list of encryption algorithms and they ask you which one of these is an asymmetric encryption algorithm. So you'll have to know the difference between these. And then I'll get to the asymmetric ones and just, so memorize the table.
What did you mean by know which is correct? Which was selected?
Which was selected, and then also, like you said, that, you'll need to know that these are symmetric versus which ones are symmetric, which are asymmetric.
It's easy for me to remember Rindell because I still say it wrong. That's not actually the way you say it. I don't even remember how the way you say it. Rindell. So I've always said it wrong, and I'll just keep saying it wrong. Because the only time I ever use the word is when I'm with you guys. All right, so here's the AES functions, 4 functions. This will be testable for sure. Subbyte, shift rows, mix columns, and add round key. You don't need to know the details of each one of these rounds or each one of these functions, but knowing that these are the functions, I think, is going to be important. 4 rows, 4 16-bit blocks. There's good information in the book on how that works. So the first function is subbyte. Subbytes is sub. There's a key there, substitution. So this is the substitution round and it's a randomization. Remember we had substitution confusion? This is the substitution round. Shift rows is the confusion round, or diffusion, sorry, where essentially we're just sprinkling data out, and it really works just like that. So if you look like like every time I look at this, I think of like Rubik's Cube, just kind of shifting everything, shifting all the colors over one. Even though, is Rubik's Cube 4x4? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 3x3? See, I don't know. I don't use Rubik's Cubes either. That's what I was asking. So I asked him, he said, what? Were you saying what to me or what to him?
They have a 4-column version.
They have a 4-column version. So what right back at you? They have a 3? The original is 3? Yeah, the 2x2? I could probably figure out the 2x2 if you give me enough time. Right, so there's shift rows, mixed columns, more diffusion by just mixing columns. So instead we were mixing rows, now we're mixing columns. And then add round key. This is the XOR function with the subkey. So, just knowing that information on the slides is plenty for test. That's the Rindell cipher, that's AES. Blowfish and Twofish were 2 finalists. Actually, Blowfish was not, Twofish was. Blowfish wasn't a finalist for the competition, but Twofish was. Symmetric block encryption, there's Bruce Schneier, 32 through 440, a little bit funkier. You don't need to know the details so much of Twofish, other than the fact that you do need to know it's a symmetric key encryption algorithm, that it was, in the running. And they are freely available if you want to. There's Blowfish and there's Twofish, both on his site. That's a picture of Bruce. If you've never seen Bruce, I've been hearing his name more and more lately. Not just here, but other places. Other symmetric key encryption algorithms, RC5 and RC6. RCs are all RSA. So, if you see RC, it's an RSA encryption algorithm. These are symmetric. RC5, 32, or 64, 128, or lots of different key ranges. RC6 was the actual finalist based on RC5, so they just keep. There was an RC4 as well. Stronger there, whatever. Knowing that.
So any of these numbers.
RC4 is an asymmetric.
RC4 is a stream cipher.
I think RC4 is asymmetric, isn't it? We'll get to it. It's not on the test, but
for the test, where if you go back real quick on that slide where he's got all those numbers and what the bits and keys, I definitely had questions about understanding and knowing which the one that has 128-bit block size to start and a max key of 2048 or 2040.
Okay.
Right. So you do need to know these numbers that are on the slide, but what he's got will cover it.
More memorization.
It is. It's so much. And then as soon as you pass the test, you're like, done.
Yeah, truly. I mean, unless you're working with this every day, I mean, we implement tools that implement these things, but, I check 256-bit AES or, I just choose. You don't normally know the details of all this, but you'll need it for the test. Asymmetric encryption algorithm. So asymmetric is one key to encrypt, a paired, a different key to decrypt, right? Those are asymmetric encryption algorithms. There's Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. They created the DiffieHellman key exchange. They set out to create an encryption protocol that they could use to exchange symmetric keys without having to use an out-of-band method, right? An out-of-band method is not efficient, right? And people, you tell them, don't email your password. If you've got to share your password with somebody or whatever, call them. Use an out-of-band, they still email it, right? So anyway, RSA invented in 1977. Again, that's what RSA stands for. 2 keys, one to encrypt and one to decrypt, but they're paired mathematically. Asymmetric encryption algorithms typically work on 2 functions. One function is really, really difficult prime numbers. The other one is called discrete logarithm, and we'll get to both of those here in a minute. that what this is? Yeah, factoring prime numbers. So the method here with this type of asymmetric encryption algorithm is take a really, really, really big number that's a prime number, and then try to multiply them together and try to figure out what the prime numbers were, right? And we're talking like really huge numbers, not like 7 times 7, and I give you 49, you know, oh, you know, the factoring there is a 7. We're talking really, really huge numbers. Really easy to compute in one direction, very, very difficult to compute in the other direction. That's the mode, or that's this method with factoring prime numbers. That's one way asymmetric encryption works. The other one is the discrete logarithm. So if I took, again, a really, really big number to the really, really big number's power, right? And then try to figure that out in reverse. If I gave you one of those two functions. So that's, you know, there's an example there. So 7 to the 13th power is really easy to go front ways. It's a lot difficult to take the big number is 7 to the what power when you're talking very, very, very large numbers. That one's easy. You know, does that make sense? The two different modes. There's also elliptic curve cryptography, which really just applies this whole function on the plotting of an elliptic curve, which will also be on the test, is usually used in low power devices. It's a little bit slower. Anyway, so questions on this? Asymmetric encryption algorithm, you'll need to know these two modes. Factoring prime numbers, really, really large prime numbers, and discrete logarithm are the two modes for asymmetric encryption. Here's the DiffieHellman. So two parties to secretly agree on a symmetric key via public channel, also called the DiffieHellman key exchange. That's essentially how it works. Mod is modular. You don't have to worry about the math. Knowing that DiffieHellman is a key exchange protocol is going to be very important for you. That was the original intent for it. Here's elliptic curve cryptography. So it's taking the discrete logarithms and just plotting it on an elliptic curve. This gets really, really mathy, really, really quick. Things to know about elliptic curve cryptography is it's an asymmetric encryption algorithm. It uses discrete logarithms. It uses an elliptic curve, and that's typically used in low power devices, less computing power.
And they're actually moving away from it because then it can be brute forced fairly easily.
Right. So in practice, they're moving away from it. In the test, it'll still be there.
Yeah.
Imagine that. All right, so trade-offs. Asymmetric encryption keys, because they'll give you examples probably on the test and tell you which type of encryption should you use, asymmetric or symmetric encryption. So this will be a really important slide as well. Asymmetric encryption is far slower. It's weaker per bit of key length. And like I was saying at the opening, typically we'd use asymmetric encryption to exchange the symmetric key and then conduct all of our communications using that symmetric key because it's faster and it's stronger. Right? So even if an attacker did capture, even if they did capture the key exchange that took place, there's probably not enough data there for them to crack it before the symmetric encryption is used. You know what I mean? Which is stronger and faster anyway. Hopefully that makes sense. But memorize this. Asymmetric encryption, slower, weaker, but used for the symmetric encryption, key exchange, so that we can communicate faster and stronger. These are just some comparisons. You don't need to memorize specifics on the comparisons. You know, I think the last slide is plenty, but this just demonstrates what we just said. Hash function. So a hash function is a one-way function. It's a one-way function. It's there are, like Haval is a variable length hash, and that'll be on the test too. But I take variable length input, run it through a hash function, and I come up with a fixed length hash value. Right? I can't get back to the original text by running backwards through the math. It's a one-way function. Where this is most popularly used is with passwords. So instead of storing passwords in clear text, instead what I store is hash values. So if an attacker did get the hash values, we've made it a little more difficult for them to get the passwords, right? Because when they're coming in the front end, they're going to have to type the same password that goes through the hash function to create the same hash value. If you put the hash value through the front end, it's not going to hash to the same value, right? You see why you would do that? So one-way hash functions, no way to reverse, variable length plaintext, doesn't matter how large the plaintext is, and most hashing functions like SHA, MD5, you'll come up with the same length hash value. The only one that's different is Haval, which nobody uses, but it might be on the test. That's a variable length. So the V in Haval is variable. But anyway, call the message digest or call the hash. We can also use it to provide integrity. So a lot of times you'll run a hash value on a file to determine if it's the same file that you downloaded. So a lot of times you'll see in download places, they'll publish an MD5 or a SHA hash value. Assuming that you download the file, you run that file through the same hash, you should come up with the same hash function, you should come up with the same hash value, right? Which would then validate that nothing changed in your download. Because two different variable lengths, two different things will hash to different values. When two different things hash to the same value, that's called a collision. Every hash function is susceptible to a collision because, logic would tell you if I have all these different variables that can go in and I only have a set number of variables that could come out, there's going to be a collision in every hash value or every hash function. It's just how easy it is to get those collisions, right? MD5 is really fairly collisionable, right? So it's not used much. You still see MD5 on file values, but you don't see it used in passwords and other things. You ever heard SALT? SALT is sometimes added to a password that goes through a hash value to randomize, what comes out on the other end. That's where SALT is used. What else about hash functions? Today, the latest, and I doubt it'll be on the test, but the latest hash function is SHA-3, which I think was released just a year ago. But what you'll probably see in the test, the latest one will probably be SHA-1. I don't think they'll have SHA-2 on there. So all the SHAs, the secure hash algorithms. Remember we had the competition that took place to create the advanced encryption standard. All the SHAs are also standards. Stands for secure hash algorithm. I don't know why they didn't stay with kind of the same naming thing, but all the SHAs have been NIST, approved. They're true standards. MD5 was never there. Any questions on this? Hash values. So symmetric, we know what those are. Asymmetric, we know what those are. And hash values, now we know what those are. Those will be the only three that will be on the exam. Did I already do this page? All right, so this is an example of a collision. So Michael and Toby, as inputs, went through the hash functions. They hashed to the same value in this example. That's called a collision, right? And so when you're doing password cracking, I'm not necessarily looking for the password. I'm just looking for something that will hash to the same value. So I'll take a collision, or I'll take the real one, because they'll both hash to the same thing, which ultimately is what's going to be used for the authentication, right? So attackers are looking for collisions. When they're doing brute force attacks on passwords, they're looking for collisions. When they steal passwords online, you ever see like the top 100 passwords for 2017, right? So passwords have been leaked or compromised, through various attacks and databases. And typically what's been attacked is the hash values. So they just crack all the hash values, and that's how they come up with that list, usually. MD5, round revest. That's the same round revest for the RSA. 128-bit hash value based on any input length. There are weaknesses for collisions. MD6 has been replaced MD5. I don't know, is there an MD7? There might be an MD7 for all. We mostly use just SHA-3 or 2 instead of any of the message digest, unless it's file downloads, because the message digest is still really popular for a lot of file downloads. So SHA, like I said, announced in 1993, SHA-1 as the FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standard, creates a 160-bit hash value out of any length input. SHA-2 recommended over SHA-1 or MD5 when it was announced in 2007. It was kind of decommissioned, I guess, in 2015, so followed with SHA-3.
MD6 is the latest.
SHA-3 was 2015 was when it was announced. What's that?
That MD6 is
MD6 is the latest. There's Haval, hash of variable length. You can see the different size message digests that can be created with Haval, 128, 160, 192, 224, and 256. Works a lot like MD5. Haval you would think would be, I've never used Haval, so I don't know, but you would think it would be a little less susceptible to collisions if I've got variable length outputs, because it creates that hash space is so much wider potentially, but I don't know that to be sure. For the test, what you need to know is Haval, and that's variable length. It's the only hash function that you'll see on the test that isn't the same hash length, I guess, every time.
So it randomly has different lengths?
Not randomly, you run it in different modes.
You tell it which one.
You tell it which one. Anybody used, what's the hell, oh man, I can't think of it. There's a tool that I use, it's been around for like ever.
Cisco Cracker?
No,
Jack the Ripper?
no, I don't know, if it comes to me. But these are what hash values look like. If you know, MD5, this would be the same input, just hashed in different ways. And you can see the different lengths and the hash values and how they're completely different, whatever. Just FYI stuff. No. It'll come to me.
Hashcat?
No. It's not a tool that's specifically used for hashing or cracking hashes. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife tool. I can't remember it. Anyway. Cryptographic attacks. So brute force is the way, this is mathematically, proven to work because you run through the entire key space and you will find you'll find it. It's just that it might take you 16 billion years, right? You'll be dead, and the work factor is so long for brute force attacks, but they always work for all key-based ciphers, except for obviously the one-time pad, but I don't know of any implementations today of one-time pad commercially. Other types of text, known plaintext. So this is where I know the plaintext and I have the ciphertext paired and I'm trying to find what the key is. That's known plaintext. Chosen plaintext and adaptive chosen plaintext are essentially very much the same. It's where I get to choose the plaintext to be encrypted. And again, what I'm trying to get at is the key. The difference between the chosen plaintext and the adaptive chosen plaintext is I adapt the next round of the attack based on the results of the previous round. So a chosen plaintext, almost all of them would be adaptive chosen plaintext, because why wouldn't I take what I learned from the previous try and apply it to the next? Chosen ciphertext and adaptive chosen ciphertext work the same way, but instead what I'm using is I'm using the ciphertext to be decrypted. Meet in the middle attack would be attacking the encryption algorithm from both directions. So trying to figure out the beginning parts of messages and the end parts of messages and kind of working in from there. Because it is a lot easier. Like, it's easier to crack a password, 14 character password if I know the first 3 or 4 characters, right? Because I've reduced, it's the same kind of attack where if I know these and I know these and I start kind of working my way in, you meet in the middle. That's how the attack works. I've used tools for these types of attacks, never actually, sat down and done any of this manually, but that's all. Known key, this is where I know the key. And I think what we're trying to get at here in a known key attack is if the key changes, would I be able to get that one too? I mean, I've never done a known key attack because it just seems counterproductive or counterintuitive, right? If I'm trying to get your encryption key that you're using for encrypting things, I got the encryption key. So what's the use in anything else? but I guess it's if you change your keys. Differential cryptanalysis is just looking how different plain texts end up being encrypted. This would be not all that unlike a frequency analysis type of attack. You're looking for differences.
If you have just the hash, can you tell what the encryption method is?
Yeah. Yep. It's pretty easy to tell the encryption method. It's hard to tell, or that it's easy to tell the hash function that was used, but not, not the collision. Depending on the type of attacks, which I think we could talk about maybe next class. Talk about brute force attacks, because typically those would be password type of attacks, and so you can do dictionary attacks, you can do brute force attacks, you can do birthday attacks, you can do rainbow attacks, maybe using rainbow tables. I mean, there's just a lot of different attacks you can do on passwords, but you can tell a hash function. Linear cryptanalysis, large amounts. So if you linear, large amounts of plain text and ciphertext. The larger the amount of data, the larger amount of ciphertext plain text pair you have, the easier the cryptanalysis, right? Because I've got more sample to work with. That's why when you use an asymmetric, even though that's weaker, and you use an asymmetric encryption algorithm to trade the symmetric encryption algorithm, the amount of data that you would attack would make a linear cryptanalysis useless. Because I think that's one of probably the best ways to attack. Side channel attacks, we talked about covert channels before. This is kind of the same concept, but it's other characteristics that would be indicators of how the encryption is operating and what's being used. Things like CPU cycles, power, sometimes emanations, things like that. The birthday attack. This is the birthday paradox. So you put 23 people in a room, the odds are greater than 50% that 2 will share the same birthday. Right? That's the paradox. That doesn't mean that they'll share your birthday. 2 or more people will share the same birthday. And I think that's where people get kind of hung up with the birthday paradox, because we internalize and think, oh, so if there's 23 people in the room, there's a greater than 50% chance that somebody's going to have the same birthday as me. That's not how the paradox works. The paradox works that in the group of 23, there's a greater than 50% chance that 2 of us, will have the same. That's used for hash collisions. Knowing what the birthday attack is probably fine. Knowing how it works, in detail is not needed. And key clustering. Any questions so far? Gosh, we got like an hour left of this, and I'm trying to go through this as fast as I can. Is this making sense?
So much of it is just memorization.
It is memorization. Digital signatures. So digital signatures, to sign. So you've got non-repudiation in a digital signature. So when you think of non-repudiation, it's public-private key pairs. This would be asymmetric encryption, primarily, that you would use. But we also implement a hash function to make sure that nothing changed. So there's also integrity in a digital signature. So non-repudiation, authentication of the identity of the signer. So in a public-private key pair, I would use my private key to sign the message and actually sign the hash of the message as well to prove that it was signed by me. It didn't change because only a public key would be able to open that message and validate that it hasn't changed, right? Does that make sense? That's how the digital signatures work. So encrypting the hash value with my private key, digital signatures provide that authentication and integrity. Because if I've encrypted the hash function and then you reverse that with the public key, now you've got access to the hash function and the hash values match, you know that the message hasn't changed. That's what it looks like. That's a separate slide, so when you get the slides, one won't cover up the other one. HMAC, MAC stands for Message Authentication Code. Used primarily in IPSec. They are similar to digital signatures. The only thing is they use a symmetric encryption instead of asymmetric. So you have the hash value and then encrypt the whole thing. You would have to have the secret key, the symmetric, to run the encrypt, to decrypt, and then validate the hash. That's how HMACs work. And that's just a explanation of how, a little bit deeper. Make sense? So if you see digital signature, it's using public key encryption. It's an asymmetric. If you see HMAC, this is symmetric encryption, same sort of function. More memorization. But I don't expect anybody to kind of be like, pick this up the first time you get it through. Like I said, 3 times, 4 times, whatever it takes to get it through long enough, and you just have to retain it for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, right? Get through the exam, and you'll be fine. Because when you get into practice, you realize what things actually matter, in your work. PKI is one of those things that matters, but it's usually a very specialized skill. In our industry, most of us aren't working with public key infrastructure, but it's maintaining, somebody's got to validate these things. Somebody's got to validate your identity. Somebody's got to validate my identity. Somebody's got to validate this public-private key pair. The private key or the public key infrastructure does that. So you've got a certificate authority. It works the same way on the internet as it does in somebody's environment. So all 3 forms of encryption to manage digital certificates. The digital certificate is a public key signed with a digital signature. So it validates my identity. Somebody has to do that. Mutual authentication and encryption with public key. And then knowing the digital certificate format is X.509. Probably good to know for the test too, but knowing the details of how the X.509 directory and all that works is not all that important. Certificate authorities within the PKI, they vouch for things. They're the ones who issue certificates and revoke certificates. When you do, the same thing works when you're on the internet. I mean, some of us know, some of us don't know that there's a certificate store, a list of trusted certificate authorities that your browser already accepts. So when you go to a website and your browser trusts the certificate authority that their private key was signed by, you won't get the thing that says, hey, this isn't a trusted website. Do you want to still proceed or not? Right? So certificate authorities are behind all of that. And there's quite a few. Digital certificates are issued by the certificate authorities, authenticate the identity of a person. Supposedly not just anybody can get a digital certificate imposed. Now digital certificates become pretty important when we talk about public and private keys and all that. Because remember, what type of mobile code is signed mobile code? It's the ActiveX, right? ActiveX controls are signed here to validate the identity and that code hasn't changed from the time it got from the server to you, supposedly. If I've compromised or a certificate authority, or I can compromise the PKI, you can digitally sign ActiveX controls that appear legitimate. The user never gets a pop-up. Do you want to run this? Because this isn't come from it just runs, right? So there's issues here. CAs can be privately run. So some companies have their own PKI, their own, works the same way as the PKI on the internet. Systems vouch for systems. Certificates, identities, message, digital signatures, and all that. There's some, but most of us think of it as public. A lot of us aren't running our own internal PKIs. Certificate revocation list. So certificate authorities issue certificates, but if something went bad, they find out that they made a mistake, or you're not as legit as you posed yourself to be at the beginning, they can revoke your certificate. That would go in the CRL. Certificate revocation list. IPSec. So IP itself is inherently insecure, right? IP was never built with security in mind. IPSec was added onto IP, a series of protocols. It's a set of protocols. It's not just one, to try to make IP secure. In IP version 6, IPSec is built in to that protocol, but most of us aren't using IP6. We're using IP version 4 still. So suite of protocol, but the same IPSec, by the way. Same implementation, just different places. So suite of protocols provide cryptographic layer, both IP version 4 and IP version 6. It just happens to be built into IP version 6. Most of us have used this before with VPNs. The Cisco VPN client was kind of now all VPN clients, not all are using this, but most of them can, right? It's either IPSec or it's an SSL VPN, TLS VPN. Two primary methods, you'll have to memorize this: authentication header and encapsulating security payload. The differences between the two. Authentication header just validates the integrity of the packet or the data. Not even the data. Well, somewhat. The packet. Encapsulating security payload, so one's integrity and the other is confidentiality. Authentication header is an integrity function. Encapsulating security payload is a confidentiality function. It actually encrypts the data. AH and ESP provide different, sometimes overlapping functionality because are part of the same suite. You also need to know the basics of ISACamp and IKE, but they're pretty self-explanatory. IKE, obviously key exchange, it's a key exchange protocol. Security Association and Key Management Protocol maintains the communications in the IPSec flow, the data flow, right? It's kind of almost a cop, the traffic cop for for IPSec. So a little more data about AH and ESP: authentication header, integrity, digital signature, protects replay attacks. It protects against man-in-the-middle attacks, proxy attacks. That's what it looks like. So there's the difference between authentication header. So if you know TCP/IP, if you don't know TCP/IP really well, or you don't know networking well, this will make a lot more sense after we start getting into the next class, right? So that's another reason why I don't want anybody sort of giving up, fight through this, because the things that we're kind of talking about now will come up again. And then it'll all start to kind of come together, and you'll start to, see how security is like puzzle pieces. They fit together. So here, authentication header, there's no encryption. Encapsulating security payload is where the encryption, the actual data and confidentiality is protected. Security Association and ISACamp. Security Association simplex, there's simplex and duplex, so we'll cover that next class too when we talk about networking. But simplex is one way, duplex is, both ways. Used to negotiate the parameters. How are we going to do ESP and AH? What encryption algorithms are we going to use? The negotiation usually starts with the strongest and then works its way down, but we have to agree on one. So if one end says, hey, let's do some AES here, the other end's like, I don't do that. How about triple DES? All right, triple DES is in my stack. Let's do triple DES. That's what SA does. That's what the Security Association does. That just explains all of that. Security Parameter Index. I don't know if SPI will be in the test or not, but it basically just keeps track of the communication, because in simplex there's no two-way communication. So you have to have some kind of counter to keep track of who am I communicating with in this process. SA, or I just called it SA. Security Association is managed by ISACamp and IKE. That's all you need to know for IPSec for now. We're going to come back to IPSec some more in a little bit more detail when we get into how networking works with security. Two modes for IPSec. So we already had authentication header, encapsulating security payload. Because this is where it gets a little bit confusing with IPSec. Those are two different things, two different protocols within IPSec. Now we've got two different modes for IPSec, right? One is tunnel mode and the other is transport mode. Tunnel mode used by security gateways. It's usually a site-to-site VPN, something like that. Tunnel mode encrypts everything. Sort of encrypts it all. It's kind of like encrypting everything. Transport mode only encrypts the data. So that's the difference between tunnel mode and transport mode. Transport mode is typically more client server or client endpoint stuff. That's what that looks like, transport mode and tunnel mode. So, and again, when we get into networking, we'll get in a little deeper into this, but you can see we add an entirely new IP header in the tunnel mode in both cases, whether it be authentication header or encapsulating security payload. So what we've got here is we've got the two different protocols that do two different things layered on two different modes, right, in this diagram. Does that make sense? It will, if it doesn't now. Trust me. Stick with it. So IKE. IKE is what negotiates what our key exchange is going to be. Again, what encryption algorithms we're going to use. We'll choose the strongest, typically. SSL and TLS. TLS is kind of the thing now. TLS 3, is it? 3.1. 3.2. 1.2. Anyway, because there's continues to be attacks on SSL and TLS. You know, man-in-the-middle attacks. Or primarily, I don't attack SSL. This is what you need to know for SSL and TLS. SSL has been around for a long, long time. Do you remember, what was the, Netscape? Remember Netscape? Remember the Netscape browser? Remember you had to pay for the browser? And then Microsoft came out with, you know, Internet Explorer, and then the browser wars kind of started. Opera, anybody an Opera fan? You have it? Yeah. I always find myself switching from Chrome and Firefox, because Chrome will start to tick me off a little bit, and then I'll go back to Firefox, and Firefox will start to tick me off, and I go back to Chrome.
How about the Brave browser?
The Brave browser? Never heard of that one. Really?
It's got the stuff built in, the encryption, anti-tracking, and
Huh.
I've been pretty happy with it.
Is it a flavor of Chrome?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. SSL, TLS, so SSL and TLS will both use public key, and they'll weave in public key and symmetric key encryption. This is just the method, the protocols that are used to do those things. SSL and TLS. TLS is the way to go. PGP, you won't ever to do anything. It's still around. Phil Zimmerman created this a long time ago. PGP, the way PGP works, it doesn't use a PKI, it uses a web of trust. Right? Which always makes me think of that Robert De Niro movie where we have the circle of trust. This is the web of trust. So if you know, I trust you, and if you trust him, then I can trust him, and that's how that encryption works.
Real quick, before you go too far, good question online. If ESP tunnel mode encrypts the whole packet, what about the path it is traveling on the open internet? It does not encrypt that. It's just encrypting the packet along the path.
In transport mode it would, in tunnel mode it would not. Good question. And those are the types of questions that you're going to see on the exam. SMIME, secure MIME. So MIME is a multipurpose internet mail extensions. SMIME is just secure. It just layers on PKI. Same kind of PKI we just talked about. Symmetric key encryption. I'm sorry, asymmetric encryption, public key encryption. And then you can configure, usually in most implementations, to, that would be the key exchange for the symmetric encryption. That's SMIME. Escrowed encryption means that parts of the keys are distributed, because we have an issue here too, right? Implementation of encryption is one thing, but then what about the security of the key itself? Like, you know, that's great that you're using encryption everywhere, but you're storing your keys on a file server that's insecured, right? So anybody can go grab those keys and then start decrypting your data. Or, which also happens, is I've encrypted my backups, my server died, and I lost the key to decrypt my backups, right? So now my backups are essentially useless. We've seen that happen before too. So escrowed encryption, you could potentially use something like this. Oftentimes this is used in two organizations working together. They'll escrow parts of the key, so no one person can decrypt something that's been encrypted. They'd have to work together to do that. The Clipper chip was a thing that didn't take long for that to die. This was the government's attempt to escrow encryption keys so that they could eavesdrop on communications. It didn't take long before there was a huge uproar and that died. 80-bit key. Anyway, Clipper chip. Anybody see what's going on in China right now? China passed a law that if you're doing business in China, you have to give them the encryption keys.
Oh, yeah.
You have to give them access to your network. It's like, I got asked a couple of days ago, hey, what do you think about, doing business in China? I'm like, hell no. I mean, not with anything that I just want to give away freely.
In general, anybody asking for that, not just China.
But you see, China was already doing that anyway. Now they're just telling you that they're doing it.
There's a bunch of vendors supposedly that have worked out deals with the government to bypass it.
They freeze palms as required.
All right, so steganography. Steganography isn't encryption at all. Steganography is hiding that there's even a message there, right? So different, it's in this chapter, but you really need to know that these are completely different. Steganography is not encryption at all. It doesn't jumble up the data. It just hides messages. A lot of times where people will hide messages is in pictures. So the human eye can't see pixels, individual pixels. So if I hide my data in individual pixels in a picture, the human eye won't see it. If we've dispersed it enough. Computers obviously will.
On that one, real quick, so you'll need to go into the next one as well, but they'll have questions like, what is this? And they'll have like steganography and stenography. So you got to read your answers really carefully because huge difference. If you're not paying attention, easy to click the wrong one.
Yeah, for sure. Digital watermarks. Digital watermarks typically use steganography, and they just put data into the stream to be able to tell where you got it from, right? When you duplicate something with a digital watermark, the watermark goes with it. And the story here is, I think like the Emmys or the Grammys or something like that, they would give out copies of movies that they were going to evaluate or something oftentimes before they were actually released to the public. And then somehow things started leaking out into the public. And so they wanted to figure out who's leaking it. So they digitally watermarked each individual copy. So when a copy got out on the internet and they see the stream, they could pull out the watermark and say, oh, Johnny gave his away. Now we're going to go slap Johnny. That's an application of digital watermarks. Holy buckets, right? That's encryption. Congratulations. A lot of memorization. It's just how you have to fight through that one. Physical security is a little bit easier because it's easier to relate to, right? Because I can see this stuff. I can touch it. I can sometimes smell it if it's a security guard who hasn't taken a shower for a while. It's funny, we were just talking, Matt Finlay is our lead social engineer, and this guy is he's like a little ninja. He's not a big dude, but man, he gets into the weirdest places, and he was just telling me how, in his last attack, how important it is to use all of your senses. Maybe not taste, because that could get weird, but how he couldn't get through this one door, this one IT door, because nobody would let him tailgate. So I was like, son of a gun, okay. But there happened to be like a stairway door further down the hallway, and he could hear when that door opened, and so he could tell when somebody had already gone through that door. So then he just needed to time when somebody went through that door. He would open up his door, make sure nobody's coming down the hall that would see him, and then go and grab the door before it closed, because the guy didn't know that somebody was tailgating, right? Because normally when you walk through a door, you notice when somebody's behind you. So just using all your kind of five senses for a lot of the attacks that he does is pretty cool, So man traps are meant to prevent unauthorized access into a system. You usually, in the exam, you'll use one authenticator to get into the man trap, and when that door closes, you'll use another authentication technique to get into the next door. Right? Lots of different types of man traps. We talked a couple of classes ago about the weight one, where you can determine if somebody's tailgating into the man trap with somebody, stuff like that. But man trap, that's what it is. It's a preventative control. Bollards are typically a safety issue. Some drivers get the gas pedal and the brake pedal screwed up, right? You've seen pictures of people running right through stores, right? So, nowadays I'm always looking for bollards.
The big red balls.
The big red ball at Target, yeah.
Aren't just there for decoration.
And you notice all the federal buildings, they didn't used to have that, but now they do, because they want to stop those terrorists from driving their trucks into the building and blowing it up. So bollards are a big thing. That's what we use bollards for. bar. Smart cards, anything that's smart has to have some circuitry on it. It's got to do something. That's a smart card in most cards. Like this is not a smart card. There's no chip here. It's just a proximity card. Whereas a smart card, typically you'll see there's contactless and contact ones. So like your pin and chip and pin, those are contact cards. They're smart cards, right? There's circuitry on the card that makes things happen. And then tailgating, you know what tailgating is, right? Piggybacking, you call it sometimes, just going in. Easy ways to do this in Minnesota is, you know, when somebody walks up to a door, you just walk up with, like you got boxes, you know. People let you in, people hold the doors for you. And people yell at you when you don't. Like I was not all that long ago, I was at a law firm downtown, and they have a secure elevator bay, right? And key card access on both sides of this thing. And I'm coming out because I'm done with my meeting, and they look like lawyers because they're, you know, well dressed, but I don't know. People came out. I walked out and I closed the door behind me, and the guy turns around and goes, "Hey, thanks a lot, asshole." I'm like, dude, I'm not going to be the reason why this thing goes down, you know. But because it feels uncomfortable sometimes to tell people to not hold the door open for people. So you got to consider what door you're talking about. What type of door is this? A door going into a store? Yeah, I'll hold that door open for you every time. If it's a key card access door, and I hold the door for anybody, I defeat the control completely. I mean, it's a waste of money to have that control even there. So anyway, tailgating's a big deal. Human safety is in red there. Human safety will always trump, especially with physical security. When you see physical security type questions, you'll see things. That's why that fire suppression one is such a big thing. Same with building evacuations, safety wardens, and things like that you'll see on the exam. People always come first. So perimeter defenses, meaning to keep people out, right? It's like the crunchy shell. It's like how most people build their networks, right? They build it with this crunchy shell. They focus so much on the perimeter and the firewall, and they forget about the things that are inside. That's the same thing with perimeter defenses here, just in a different way. We should employ the defense in depth. We should do more of the gobstopper type approach, right? Get into one level, get into one level, get into one level. And a lot of organizations are doing that fairly well. Fences are typically, most fences are deterrent control. Some of them can be preventative. If they're bigger, barbed wire fences obviously are more preventative. Electrical fences, you don't see a lot of those anymore because there's a lot of legal liability with having an electrical fence. People do the stupidest things with electrical fences. You've ever seen anybody pee on an electrical fence? You see the results of some of those? Oh yeah, don't ever pee on an electrical fence. I mean, I've done a lot of stupid things in my life, but not that.
I talked with the red team security guys in St. Paul.
Yeah.
They're talking about like the whole kind of caramel center type of thing you're saying.
Yep.
Of like, yeah, they'll just put up a fence, barbed wire on it, like we're secure.
Right.
You know, like I can go buy a carpet.
Yeah, exactly. Lay the carpet over.
Wire, take a ladder, and then defeat that. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know.
Defense in depth and having mitigating controls, right? I mean, one control should compensate for another control. You know.
So it's like this, like wall or whatever system you set up that costs you thousands of dollars to defeat it under $50.
Right.
So.
The illusion of security.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's the appearance, and sometimes that works too, right? Sometimes we do put physical controls in place just to make people feel safe. We know that they can, and you know that they can be defeated very easily, but that's not the point of the control anyway. The point of the control is to make people feel like they're safe, like TSA. That's the whole purpose of TSA. It just makes everybody feel safe. Can it be defeated? Sure. I mean, how many times have we seen it be defeated? But it makes people feel good. I don't know. Is it 0? Yeah, I know. It's just a pain in my butt. But I get it too, right? I mean, I'd rather fly in them. Gates. So 4 types of gates. You'll have to memorize these 4 types of gates. There's residential gates all the way up to restricted access gates. Restricted access gates would be the ones, you know, like the ones you see that come out of the ground. big concrete things, metal, steel things. Yeah, those would be class 4 restricted access. And sometimes you can tell the type of facility by the type of gate, right? Because typically we want data centers, secure facilities to be inconspicuous. We don't want you to know that it's there, but a lot of times you can pick it out by the gate. You see different types of gates, and why would the hell would I have
All that air handling equipment on the roof that you'd say?
Yeah, well, I was at a data center. I was talking about this morning with some other guy. One of the most impressive data center I ever went to was First Data Center in Omaha. They process like a third of the world's GDP like every day there. I mean, it's a serious data center built into a hill. And I was doing an assessment of First Data on behalf of Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo had hired me to go out and do this assessment. And we're talking about, man, like this is some cool stuff. I mean, they don't care about being inconspicuous in this one because
It's Omaha.
well, and they'd rather have the controls there. But even then, you still couldn't really tell it was a data center because they had every one of their chillers, every one of their generators were all closed. I mean, you couldn't tell. The only way you could tell is the guns. There were people, guards with guns and stuff. But it was cool because their walls they wouldn't tell you what they were necessarily made out of, but there was an exterior wall and then something in the middle and then an interior wall. And the guy, and I remember because I made a joke. He said, "Yeah, and this will, take a full hit of dead-on hit from a commercial airliner." I'm like, "You never tested that." He's like, "Well, no." Just going to my report then. You never tested that.
Compared to Switch.
Switch?
Yeah, out of Vegas. Switch.
Never been there. No. Been to data centers in lots of places, but not to that one. Anyway, so gates. Memorize your gates.
Yeah.
That'll be on the test. That's a fail.
I've seen that.
I know this is typical. This is you've seen it in practice, not just this one on the internet.
Not that one. I've seen that stuff.
Southwest.
Yeah, it's like it just
Twin
blows your
Cities
mind.
over here.
Yeah.
You're like, it's great for somebody who's really played.
So somebody spent the money to put this thing in here, and yeah.
Well, sometimes it's fencing too. They'll have fencing along the front perimeter of the property, but it ends at the property line, and you can just walk right around.
I know, right? Yeah, people are funny. Bollards. So bollards are really designed to stop vehicles. They're designed to stop cars. So if you see two bollards that are like 10 feet apart, stupid, right? Easily a vehicle can get through that. So you want them, appropriately spaced. You want them appropriately into the ground. These are the words, whatever. You know what a bollard is really what's important in the exam. This is from a real assessment that I did. So you can see, first of all, on the power, they're not spaced appropriately. And then look at that, it's ice right here. That's ice, man. And what's that? Well, I'm like, what happens if this person doesn't stop very well, and this guy's parked right next to it? Like, holy balls. I mean, that'd be cool to see, but probably not safe.
Plus, those are for an accident to keep somebody from backing into it, not
Right.
intentionally driving through it.
Right. Well, it's a nightmare waiting to happen. I mean, because you got ice there too. I mean, it's like, wow, so many things wrong with this picture.
Well,
They did fix it.
I think was he saying those bollards aren't going to stop a car anyway?
Not an intentional car. It'll stop an accidental, which I would have accepted stopping accidental because this was a rural, probably not a target for terrorists, somebody intentionally, but that other one's inexcusable. I mean, that's accidental, blow the town up kind of stuff. All right, different lights. Lights are a detective and a deterrent control. People like to attack places where they won't be seen. When you look at a building perimeter, shrubbery, you think it looks nice, but it also provides really good cover. Shrubbery, especially in front of windows and in front of doors, or not, you wouldn't have them in front doors, but near doors. It's a great place to hide. A lot of buildings have lighting just in front, and they don't even consider the things that are happening in the back of the building where there is no lighting. A hospital I was at, recently, well, not all that recently, but just popped into my mind, had really good physical security and really good lighting in the front. In the back was a park, like a public park. So it was unlit for a while. And I don't know if you've ever been to parks late at night, but that's a place that usually attracts weird people. So it was just, that was certainly a deficiency. Not that lighting would have prevented anything, but it might have deterred something. What's that?
I do that all the
I know.
A lot of time at parks.
Well, I was hired for this. I was being paid well for this.
Personal hell in Pokemon Go. Weird
Oh yeah, crazy. But most people do their physical security assessments, and most people, like a CISO, knows what controls they have in place and knows what the building looks like during the day. Very few actually know what it looks like at night. And most of the attacks, physical attacks, happen at night. So, the lighting is actually really important.
So real quick, going back to lighting, one of the things I remember is what NIST states is effective, which is building should be illuminated with two candles of light in a projection that is 8 feet high. So you need to be able
That'd be on the test?
I remember seeing, I don't remember on the test, but I sure as heck remember that being drilled in and needing to know and understand that.
So repeat that again.
So it's in the NIST, it's a NIST standard, but
Do which standard?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't remember that. I just have NIST states. For effective perimeter control, buildings should be illuminated with 2-foot candles of light in a projection that is 8 feet high.
8 feet high.
So you got to have a light 8 feet up, projecting down 2 feet out.
Oh, okay. I can't imagine it.
I don't remember. I have it in my notes, so it must have been important.
Is it 8 feet high or higher? Or is it just
It has to be 8 feet. That's the minimum. It's 8 feet high and 2 feet.
Yeah.
2 candle foot out.
The candle foot is this. It's just how much light
Or foot, yeah.
a candle puts out a foot.
It's gotta be bright enough and high enough.
Right.
Yes.
Well, and another thing about lighting is you've got some serious safety issues too, like lighting parking lots and places like that. So lighting is really important. It shouldn't be overlooked in your security strategy. Closed circuit television, it's still really even the cost of CCTV has come down so much, and a lot of it's not even CCTV anymore, right? It's cloud-based, web-based. Because when you think of CC, the CC is closed circuit. A lot of those aren't closed circuit anymore. So if you're, splitting hairs,
buy those cameras from China?
yeah, buy all the cameras from China and just set them up default. You don't need to change passwords or anything like that. You can get fake ones. Yeah. Well, most people. There's a lot of people. Where we like to see cameras is all ingress, egress points into the facility. We like to see cameras pointing in most directions on the building exterior so you can see approaches into the building. And we like cameras in and around, so in and around sensitive areas. So data centers, we like cameras in data centers, we like cameras around data centers. Because when bad things, usually you don't use cameras unless something bad happens, right? Somebody's not usually sitting there, in most cases, watching the cameras live. But it's when something bad happens, and then it becomes really important to find out who did what when. A lot of those crimes are prosecutable because they're typically local. The attacker was here, as opposed to a lot of the other, security crimes that happen from Nigeria. You're never going to prosecute anybody there anyway. But what also becomes really important, one of the other things that is really important with these is if you have the DVR or the NVR in-house, so you're not writing out to the web somewhere, that you secure that system. So it doesn't do you any good if it's just in the rack in your data center and you're monitoring your data center, because they can just take the DVR or the NVR, right? Or banks, where they traditionally put these things, is in the break room. In the break room on top of the microwave. And some of them are still using VHS tapes, right? But I mean, you just know, if I was attacking a bank, I would just go right there, take that with me. I mean, because all banks are putting them in the same place and they don't secure them. But it is certainly a deterrent control if I see a camera. I mean, when I walk around, I actually look, more for cameras. And when I see cameras, then I don't pinch my wife's butt. No, I'm just kidding. I was trying to think of something that I would do that's a little risque, but not illegal. Because I don't do illegal stuff that you know of. No, I don't.
Evan, was that you that was telling me, or Brad, that having those fake domes actually illegal? I
don't know if it is in Minnesota, but it could be.
You have to check the law. The other thing would be a liability in that if there is an accident and they claim you've got a camera and you don't have an actual camera,
it could be some kind of issue. Well, sometimes there's privacy issues too with cameras. Employees don't, like every law firm that we work with, I don't know of any of them that are putting cameras where they should be because they're all big on their privacy thing.
Real quick, the question was putting the fake cameras, is that a legal issue?
Could be.
For online.
I mean, nowadays, anything can be a legal issue, right? I wouldn't recommend it. Just they're so inexpensive now. Just put in a real one. All right, so infrared devices that can see in the dark. So get a camera system that's not an old, CCD type camera. One that's infrared that can see in the dark. You can see the infrared ones because I got the circle of, looks like little light bulbs that go around it. Those aren't really light bulbs, it's the infrared. Tube cameras or analog devices, you won't see those anymore, the old CCDs. Well, you do still see them, but you shouldn't. Mechanical irises, most of them aren't mechanical irises all that much anymore. Well, actually, that's not true. A lot of them are. But they've also got digital, irises implemented for additional zooming in. Things that are important for cameras are depth of field and field of view. So how far can I see accurately and how wide can I see? So depth and field. I think you replaced all those cameras. We remember way back when? And those cameras were...
We did replace them.
Okay, well then I won't go any further. I'll just leave it there.
I worked with one that was upgrading their cameras at a dorm facility. And they had the cameras in for 15 years, and they had one prosecution in all the fights, because if the fight took place more than 10 feet from the camera,
they couldn't
tell who it was, and these were 100-foot long, and they had cameras on each end. So everybody knew, and they'd all go and be in the middle. You couldn't tell who did what.
Practically it comes, where do they mount the cameras? All the on-TV things, if you see this suspect, the camera's always like ceiling mounted, aimed down at someone who's wearing a hoodie and a ball cap. And you see a little scruff, maybe the goatee from the bottom.
Yeah.
I talked to a store owner in St.
Camera
Cloud,
placement's very
where
important.
they had the cameras at just above counter level. Mm-hmm. So anybody that came up to the counter, boom, right square in the face.
Right.
And they actually caught a few people who were stealing from their shop. They had good film.
Well, when you set up a camera, I mean, obviously you should. I mean, it's kind of crazy because everybody should, like, what do I see? All right, it works for what I'm looking for.
Yeah. The really cool one we did was, how they have the height bar as you walk out? Yeah. They have cameras built into those now. So that as you walk out, you can't see it in there, but you can get it built into basically the frame of the door.
That's cool. Yeah, there's so many cool technologies for cameras now. All right, pan, tilt, zoom. So PTZ sometimes is what they call the pan, tilt, zoom. So pan, tilt, zoom, right? For cameras, sometimes, they're just fixed cameras. Depends on what. Usually you do a PTZ camera if you wanted to avoid buying multiple cameras, or if there's somebody live watching the camera. So you're employing security guards that they see something unusual, so they want to pan back and zoom in. That's usually when you get a PTZ camera. Fixed camera view, whatever, auto scan, multiplexing. Auto scan means typically if I've got, if I'm monitoring multiple cameras at the same time, it would auto scan, back through them. Multiplexing would allow me to have those multiple feeds. Magnetic tape, such as VHS. Yep, if you're using that, that's crazy. But anyway, you could potentially use that. DVR and NVR. are the most common, and a lot of them are cloud-based now. A lot of people are using cloud-based camera surveillance, which is legit too. Any questions on any of that? Or stuff for CTV? I think I already talked about that same exact stuff. Yeah, there's some bad examples. So on that one, power's right next to the camera. You'd want all of that. And I mean, if you're going to go with that's a crappy camera. But if you were going to go with something like that, you'd want it all enclosed and locked and secured so that you can't just clip it or unplug it. And even if you did have it unplugged, the fact that it's by the door and then the attacker, all he has to do is reach around, so you'll never ever see them, and then unplug it. So it's a bad placement too. And that other one, obviously, not looking at anything. Locks. So locks are preventative controls. They're not so much deterrent. I suppose they could be, in the right context. Attackers will go after the point of least resistance typically. So they'll go through windows and doors. They'll pick locks that are easier to get through. Key locks are the most common type of lock, and you guys all see them. I was going to bring in our lock picking set. We have a lock. You guys, anybody here pick locks? Yeah. We have a bunch of lock picking wizards here. Use them in all types of attacks, but what he's going to show you is just practice locks, right? Where you can see how the tumblers work and the pins align and all that stuff. But anyway, physical key locks, we don't really like physical key locks because all of them can be picked or bumped, and so there's no accountability, right? Unless there's a mitigating control or a compensating control of a camera surveillance, we don't know who comes and goes in and out of that door. Yeah, so here's just a practice lock. That's a bumper. That's a boring one. Do we have any other ones?
That's the only ones you had on the set.
It's a lock pick set. There's a lot of rakes there and stuff. If you ever want to look at it, people just play with that stuff. So things about locks. So when you put a key in, the bumps, it is aligning the pins with the shear line. Once the pins are aligned with the shear line, it'll allow the tumbler to turn, right, which then disengages the lock. That's how they work. Incorrect key, misaligned pins, jamming the lock and plug so you won't be able to turn it. That all makes sense. Ward and warded locks, keys through channels, whereas a warded lock is like that skeleton key. And I wish I had one to show you because I could show you the difference between those two. Spring bolt lock has springs in and out of the door jamb. So this is the door jamb, springs in and out. We don't like the spring bolt exposed, so sometimes you'll see the covers over. Those can be defeated too, but just by ripping off the cover. But sometimes you can just shim doors, so you can go bypass the lock and just use a credit card. You've used all kinds of just things that whatever fits in there, plastic knife, whatever. Deadbolt is rigid. You've seen what a deadbolt is. That makes sense. Oh, that's good. Here's some diagrams or pictures of things. You've got a deadbolt over there, a spring bolt lock. You can see the driver pins. This is what it looks like inside of the lock. I'll show you guys maybe next class. But the key pins, shear line, once there's alignment, it allows it to turn. It's as simple as that. That's a warded lock. Yeah, easy. We don't like locks typically, because we don't have any accountability. Even when people put "do not duplicate" on locks, okay, right? Because a lot of times, if you Matt was just showing me one of the ways he duplicates keys is he just takes the key and puts it on his arm and makes an impression. It'll stay there for like 10 minutes, long enough for him to walk out. If he doesn't have like silly putty or something else on him,
Tape.
Yeah, tape. I mean, there's just so many ways to duplicate keys without having to go to like the hardware store and have a key made. That's one way too. People lose keys all the time. I mean, if you lose keys and that key, the one key that you lost opens up, 20 doors in the facility, that's 20 doors that I need to go back and rekey, right? Most people don't do that. Lock picking, you can see that's a tension wrench, and then the pick itself. So these are all picks, and ones with multiple bumps, I call them rakes You rake them back and forth. Yeah, picking locks. It's kind of a fun thing. It's a fun hobby if you do lock picking. These guys have competitions for lock picking.
It's scary how quickly you can do a master lock.
Oh yeah, and he bought something else too. Anyway, yeah, weird security people.
The cylinder one?
Mm-hmm.
To do for safes.
Yeah.
Lock pick for safes.
Thankfully, Matt's a good boy, or good guy, bad guy. So master and core locks. So master lock opens, it's a master lock. It opens multiple doors, or maybe even all doors. The core key pulls the core, so you can recore the lock and essentially replace the lock, right? So my key would work in that, or if I could pull the core, I can certainly get the lock out. So anyway, master keys and core keys, these we want to have under very strict control. You lose one of these, and then you have to rekey everything, or entire building. Combination locks, we also don't necessarily like combination locks. There's pin pad locks. Pin pad locks we don't like either, because the numbers that get worn are the numbers that get used. And now you can get infrared. Have you ever seen the infrared cameras that you can get one for your iPhone? And they're fairly good, and you can walk up behind after somebody just went through the door and just take a picture, and it'll show you what numbers they pushed. Because there's still some heat there.
The lock on my new door, it scrambles the codes. So every time you push a number, it has 4 buttons with 3 numbers in each.
Yeah.
Every time you push a number, it scrambles it. So you got to find the next number within there. So
that's cool.
You can't shoulder surf. You can't. It defeats that.
That's cool.
I'm a nerd.
Yeah, you are.
My wife is not amused.
So combination locks, weak form of access control. Smart cards and magnetic stripe cards, 2 different cards. You can see that this is a smart card. It's got the chip. Most of our credit cards are all smart cards. Can be used, in this case, it would be used as a physical access control device. Integrated circuit card, again, same thing. Contact or contactless. Contactless would require a power source, so the power source can either be supplied by the reader itself, it will activate the card, or the power source is on the card itself. But anyway, contactless always requires a power source. Contact cards are the ones you have to insert, like at the gas station. Magnetic stripe cards are, they've just got the mag stripe on the back, right? And you've got a mag stripe reader. All pretty basic stuff. RFID and RFID tags, transponders, all that kind of good stuff built into smart cards. Not necessarily, or usually in the magnetic stripe cards. Then you got combo cards, which is, both. There's a mag stripe reader. They come really small too. One attack that I was involved in helping, not helping with the attack, but helping with the investigation. A waiter had a reader this small and had it fit on their finger, and so when they would take the payment from a patron, when they walked back, they would just go like this. I mean, it looked completely natural. And they just wrote the whole mag stripe into the flash drive that was stored in their little reader. Then they'd go and and then they were selling those online. So we don't like mag stripe readers very much.
How'd you find that?
Huh?
How'd you find it?
We were just hired to come and investigate to see if anything else happened. They actually found it. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't actually have to bust them, but I thought it was pretty ingenious. There's a lot of different attacks like that too, like the faces for ATM machines and the faces for gas station. It's just storing that mag data, the mag stripe data, which is less useful now because now of the integrated circuits, the smart card stuff. So common access card this is just an example. So did you ever get a common access card when you were in the military? This is what the old ones look like, but basically you would eat with it, pay with it, get access to buildings with it. I mean, you do kind of everything with it. It's got a mag stripe, it's got an integrated circuit, it's got...
That's too new.
Okay.
Way before my time.
Yeah.
I had them.
You had one?
I had one.
You have to use it to like log on to stuff.
They trust us.
I have two of them actually.
Yeah.
Yeah?
One for admin rank.
Oh, nice.
Sure doesn't hurt.
But that's an example of a pretty cool
Admin credential.
device. Tailgating, piggybacking, we don't like that. Obviously, helping the door, I'm not going to beat that over the bush. There's tailgating and piggybacking. Those aren't the right kind. That's the right kind. Man's traps and turnstiles, this is preventative controls for piggybacking. And I suppose, in the right context, again, it could be a deterrent control. If I was going to attack this building, I see they got a turnstile, I might go somewhere else. But you've seen turnstiles. There's different kinds of turnstiles, like in downtown Minneapolis. It's common to have those electronic turnstiles where they've just got the, it's the same technology that you'd use on your garage door, the eye that looks across. So when you badge, it wants one to go through. If two go through, now it's easy to defeat, so usually there's a guard around there too. There's a guard station nearby. But then you've got those metal turnstiles that turn around and they interlock with each other. It's hard to piggyback to that one. But yeah, all kinds of different turnstiles and man traps.
That if you go through and you don't badge through, it comes up and hits you right.
Like the neck?
No, a little.
Oh, okay, sorry. Should have badged. That only has to happen once or twice before you get that one. Contraband checks is another thing like UPS. If you've ever seen the UPS facility before, there's a guard check. Everybody that goes through that guard check gets everything that they're carrying checked to see what are you bringing into the facility and what are you leaving with the facility. That's another control. Motion detectors and other perimeter microwave motion detectors like a Doppler radar. It sends out, it's an active control, not a passive control. So it's out, it's waiting to hear back, right? It works a lot like a radar detector. Just if something disrupts the waves, disrupts the timing and when it receives the signals back, something must be there. That's that kind of motion detector. Photoelectric motion sensor, that's the beam of light. That's the one I was trying to think of when I was talking about in the turnstile. It's a photoelectric sensor. That's the same kind that you see in your garage door. The safety thing, so it'll go back up when it gets broken. That's read-only, and that's what those look like. There's the garage door one, and that's one in commercial. Other alarms, magnetic door alarms. You see the magnetic contact alarms. Those can, there's a defeat for every control, but those are, fairly common. They look like this. Essentially, if there's something that breaks that circuit, so there's an electrical current that's flowing through, and when something breaks that circuit, so if I open that door that breaks the circuit, that's going to set off the alarm. That's more of a commercial one. Well, they're both kind of commercial. You see both of those kind in a lot of applications. Doors and windows. Again, we hate windows on data centers, so we see them still. We don't even like data centers on exterior walls, right? Typically, that's pretty common too. Gypsum wall, so sheetrock is very easy to get through. So in some applications, it's a sufficient control. In others, you want more, concrete, steel, something like that. Even those can be defeated, right? Even bomb-proof places can be, if you get a big enough bomb, I suppose. Don't test that either. Emergency exits should be marked as emergency exits. Typically, you want some kind of an alarm. Now, it doesn't have to be an audible alarm because there's different types of alarms too, right? There's the audible alarm, siren going off, and then there's also somebody at a desk somewhere gets an alert that says, hey, this door just opened. So different types of alarms. Usually you want emergency exits to be alarmed. Not only do you have the contact alarms, but then you also have what are called door ajar alarms. If the door stays open for too long, that should also, probably trigger an alarm for somebody to go and investigate. Maybe the door is malfunctioning. Maybe somebody's holding it open. Maybe somebody's propping it open while they're going out to have a cigarette or something. All potentially violations of your policy. But the same thing applies, the same type of thing applies with windows. The different types of windows, you'll have to go with code, but, plexiglass windows, Lexan windows are better than just sheets of glass, obviously. I've got all kinds of stories with this stuff, but I'm not going to go there. Walls, floors, so, you know, in a data center or a secure area, you want the wall to run deck to deck, right? You don't want to be able to go under the wall or go over the wall. So you pop ceiling tiles and you look to see, does this actually go deck to deck? Or is it really easy just to get a ladder and just climb over and nobody would know I was in there? Same with like false floors, raised floors in data centers. Sometimes those raised floors go to the wall, and then on the other side you've got this ramp that goes out. Have you ever seen those? Sometimes you can get in through the ramp and up through the raised floor. So I mean, it's just things like that to think of when you're talking about floors and ceilings and walls. Guards are, you know, a good control. They're an active control. They're a deterrent control. They're a preventative control. They're a detective control. It just depends on what the guard's doing and how they're being used. But guards are great controls. There's different types of guards: armed guards, unarmed guards, off-duty police officers, rent-a-cops, whatever, right? Tons of different kinds of guards in different types of applications. Dogs, we don't see dogs used much because dogs, there's a big liability potentially in using dogs. If a dog mauls somebody on accident, you know, you've got an issue. But dogs are a great deterrent control. They're also a good detective control because they bark when things happen. Like I got little dogs at my house because I live with my daughter and my wife, and they like little dogs. So I have little dogs. And every time anything happens in that house after any time, damn dogs bark. Sons of bitches, right? So great detective control. I know when the mailman's coming. I know when somebody's out walking their dog. I know my wife is home. I mean, I know everything's going on with those dogs. But anyway, dogs, remember that the primary setback for dogs is that they're not used very often because of liability issues. Sites, I'm a little bit over, I'm 5 minutes over, but I'm still going to keep pushing through. I might have to stop soon because I'm only at 119. I think I've talked too much. Maybe it's the thing, whatever. Site selection, design, and configuration, nothing one can compensate on based on where you've chosen to build your building and house your stuff. The thing is, you're stuck there, right? One of the things that we do when we do physical security assessments is we have to account for the crime rate in the area that you operate in, right? Really high crime rate, we'd expect a lot different perimeter controls for sure, and probably interior controls as well. So it's not uncommon to get a company to get dinged pretty hard because they're in a high crime area. Like, well, we can't move. Like, the risk is still there, right? Yeah, I understand you can't move. You maybe should have chosen a better place. But the risk is there, and that's the point. We have to point out what the risk is, right? So site selection is big. If you're moving into a new location, account for those things. If you're already in a location, just expect your controls to be a little bit higher and expect to accept more risk being in that location. Topography, using the layout of the land, you know, as controls. You know, there are data centers that are built into hills, built into mountains. You know, use the topography. At best, utility reliability. I did Experian was another data center I was in Manhattan once, and they have power outages where this data center is like every multiple times a month. You know, significant. So they've got all this power generation equipment to keep the data center running. But you have to account for reliability. So they had accounted for that by putting in. I actually got to go down underneath and see where the data lines run. So I was able to go under the what the hell do you call it? The street. Holy crap, that was a rat's nest. I mean, it was just like, I don't know how you can tell anything that runs there. That's a whole other story. But with utility reliability, you have to account for crime rate. I already mentioned that. That's also lighting, right? That's going to accommodate what you're going to do for lighting. I mean, if you're in a high crime area, you want some pretty good lights for people and some safety controls. Site design and configuration issues, site marking, we've talked about that. Inconspicuous is usually best, unless you're willing to deal with whatever attention you draw to yourself, right? Shared tenancy in adjacent buildings, these are always issues. There's been plenty of attacks where somebody has actually gotten into one facility by compromising another facility, so you have to account for that. You have to account for what types of other businesses are here, right? If a liquor store is in the same building as your building, that's going to attract a certain crowd. If you have a bar, or even across the street or nearby, right? You have to account for kind of all those things. If you have a law firm that does very controversial legal work, right? That's going to draw. So you just have to be aware of and account for those things, because it is easier to attack one through another. They may not take security as seriously as you do. Shared DMARC and all these big buildings there's one place where all these circuits come into, and that's called the shared DMARC. And in some cases, those shared DMARCs are not well segregated, and they're not well secured. It's a great attack point, and they're usually not that well monitored. Guards don't make a lot of rounds through shared DMARC locations, because it's usually like off of the shipping dock, right? You have a shipping dock in the basement, and somewhere back in this hallway, way back here, is your shared DMARC. There's not a lot of traffic there either, so it's a great place, potentially to attack. Be aware of that. System defenses. So we've talked about asset tracking, knowing where your assets are. I can't secure what I don't know I have. The same thing applies for physical assets, obviously. Port controls. It's not uncommon to have, because like take a hospital, for instance. A hospital has public access points. That's their business. The public comes into those areas, or government buildings. It doesn't make sense to have a network port active in a reception area or a waiting area. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about port control. There are things that you can use like 802.1x. You can do network access control, all kinds of other things, but here it's just using port control. We'll get into the other stuff. We talk about networking. Goodies. Drive and tape encryption. Did I tell you that the rule of thumb for using encryption? I use encryption where I can't assure physical security of the media. Media at rest and media in transit, right? So transmission media or storage media. If I can't assure the physical security, so like tape drives get encrypted, mobile devices get encrypted, because they don't stay in one spot. I can't keep the physical control. Public, anything I send out an email with confidential information, I can't control the transmission media. That gets encrypted. Do you see where I use encryption? If I've got super strong physical controls, I could potentially make a case to not encrypt, right? That's typically, and that's drive and tape encryption, media storage and transportation, all that. It's about that. Media cleaning and destruction, we've talked about that already. Those are concerns for physical security. Environmental controls, electricity, HVAC. There's a lot of things with physical security that kind of come into our purview, may not fall directly under. A lot of times in bigger companies, you'll separate physical security from information security, and they'll just have to work together. But environmental controls like HVAC systems, electricity, the reliability, the number one thing that happens, the most unreliable thing for any business, any data center is electricity. It's always electricity. You'll need to memorize this. So I even put memorize on it, because it really meant to memorize it. The different types of electrical faults that we have. Blackout is a prolonged loss of power. A brownout is a prolonged low voltage. I don't know why they're such sticklers on this, but it was big when I took my test. It was big when he took his. Big on everybody's. Fault is a short loss of power. Surge, prolonged high voltage. A spike, temporary high voltage, and a sag is temporary low voltage. So get these slides, memorize this. It's also, in your book. All right. Surge protectors. We know what surge protectors do. Surge protectors protect against momentary losses or voltage fluctuations. Uninterruptible power supplies. Longer interruptions, but including power outages. But we need to have sufficient runtime for something to take over afterwards. Sufficient runtime to either shut down gracefully or transfer to longer term power, like a generator, right? And most generators, most of them are being installed nowadays with automatic transfer switches, so that the switch is automatic. You used to have to flip the switch. Generators, different kinds of generators, and if you were ever going to use a generator, you would probably consult with somebody who would sufficiently size it for your application. Diesel generators, making sure that you have enough diesel fuel on site, making sure the diesel fuel is conditioned, making sure that you're testing the generator on a regular basis, it's under maintenance, all that stuff. But there's also natural gas generators, propane, all kinds of different generators.
Another one is, can your data center get fuel? When Hurricane Sandy hit, a bunch of those were.
Exactly, yeah. So getting fuel. So having multiple contracts, if it's a sensitive enough data center, can you justify multiple contracts from 2 suppliers too? That's not uncommon because no matter what you do, you're not going to get your fuel before critical infrastructure. You're not going to get your fuel before the hospitals get their fuel. You're not going to get your fuel before.
Well, if the roads are impassable, you're not getting your fuel anyway.
Right. And that was a big reason why First Data had built their data center in Omaha. I guess there's a lot of fuel distribution there that it was really, really close to them, so it made it easy. Electromagnetic interference. This is a disruption. EMI usually comes from like fluorescent lights, fans, and when it's run close to data cables, it cuts it out, right? Or at least interferes with it. That's due to the magnetism for cable management. HVAC systems, okay, we're 15 minutes. Should we keep going? I'm gonna leave it to you guys. I got 23 more slides. Otherwise, we can start with the 23 slides on Tuesday. Keep going? All right. Rock on then. That's what we do. I love the attitude around here. Right?
Yeah.
All right, let's go then. HVAC, positive pressure and drain. So we want positive pressure. Now, there's all kinds of different data center designs nowadays. Some of them are actually negative pressure, and I mean, there's just all kinds of different. In general, and for the exam, we want positive pressure. That means if there's a leak, it drains out, it pushes out. If there's a contamination in the data center, it vents out, it pushes out. If there's a fire, it vents out and pushes out, right? That's the whole purpose between positive pressure and drains. Temperature, these are temperature guidance. Generally, 70-ish degrees is sufficient, because you'll see every one of these organizations has different power or different temperature, I guess, optimization or whatever. And this isn't nearly as big a deal as it used to be. Like in the older equipment, man, we really had to be careful about temperature because there were such high failure rates. The mean time between failure, which is another thing we'll talk about later, was really quite low. Static electricity used to be a big deal. Has anybody ever had to tie off before? You don't have to do that nearly as much as you used to. You got to do that on everything, right? Because when you'd kill it, or it hurt when you got, when you got the shock. Yeah, we hate cardboard. You never unbox systems in a data center because there's so much particulate and there's so much contamination in the data center from that. Those are all things you have to be really careful of. The thing for the test here is humidity leads to corrosion, heat leads to static. Those are the two things that are really important in the test. The higher the heat, lower humidity, static, higher humidity, corrosion. That's what I meant to say. Low humidity, static, high humidity, corrosion. So humidity is very important in data centers. And there's the guidance, 40 to 55% recommended, 68 to 77 degrees for temperature. I don't know if they'll be that specific on the exam, but just know the importance. So not only is it important to maintain these levels, but it's also important to monitor, wild fluctuations in these levels, and also to monitor outside of the threshold, outside of the clipping level, is I guess what you call it, the clipping level for those. Static and corrosion, this is what static and corrosion is. I've already mentioned that. So maintaining proper humidity levels, low and high. We've all seen the wrist straps, or some of us have used the wrist straps before. You don't see them nearly as much as you used to. Airborne contaminants, we don't like airborne contaminants. The thing that fails most in data centers are any moving parts, right? So fans used to be hard drives. Now there's a lot more SSDs being used, and hard drives are built better. But moving parts are the parts that fail in data centers. Dust gets into fans, it throws off heat, and you have a lot of problems. Yeah, so there's all kinds of different VESDA units. You guys ever seen a VESDA unit? Very early smoke detection apparatus. That's what a VESDA. But a VESDA unit can also be used to identify airborne contaminants in the data center. You can always tell a VESDA unit because it's got the orange tube. That's usually they're hanging in different places in the data center. That's the VESDA. Heat, flame, and smoke detectors. 3 methods for detecting fire: heat, flame, and smoke. So heat is wild fluctuate. That's a pretty easy one because it's just a significant increase in the temperature of the data center. Indicates maybe there's a fire. Flame is typically a photoelectric. It notices the flicker of the flames, and that sets that one off. Smoke sends, can also be photoelectric, but it can also be infrared, right? It's getting, the same kind of thing with motion detection, sending out a signal and it's coming back much quicker, or it's too variable. That would also set off those alarms. So heat detectors, easy enough. Large fluctuation of heat in a short period of time. There's the 2 different types of smoke detectors, ionization-based and photoelectric, and what they do. And then flame detectors is just looking for the flickering light, that flames give off. Different types of detectors and different types of applications. It's not like one is better than the other. You'd have to get into data center design if you really wanted to design it correctly, or building codes. A lot of times these are driven by the fire marshal or whoever's in charge of, enforcing the fire codes for that area. Safety training and awareness, really big deal. So you'd expect to see something because they really, really stress physical safety, personal safety on the exam. So this will be definitely on the exam. Safety and training and awareness, evacuation routes, having those well defined and communicated to everybody in the facility. And even nowadays, people are starting to stress telling visitors evacuation routes, ways that they, their safety procedures, which, I guess is kind of interesting. Evacuation rules and procedures. So who's going to do what when an evacuation? Usually we would build this into usually the BCP, or it could be a BR. There's a business resumption plan sometimes, or a crisis plan. It kind of depends on how but it's documented. Whatever plan you're going to put it in, who's going to do what. 2 roles: the safety warden, which is really their job is to kind of coordinate and make sure everything kind of happens that's supposed to happen during an evacuation. People are getting out in an orderly fashion, whatever. In larger facilities, there's usually a safety warden per floor. And then there's a meeting point leader. And that meeting point leader is taking a roll call. Who's here, who's not, and then reporting back typically to the safety warden. Everybody made it out. So those 2 primary roles, those are kind of what those are used for. Here's your ABCD fires and suppression. This is going to be really important. Different types of fire extinguishers for different types of fires. You don't throw water on an oil fire or a chemical fire.
So I've got the cheat sheet for that.
Whoops.
Oh, no, that's good. That works. So fire extinguisher, A is ash, right? B is boil, C is computer, and then K is kitchen. And if you don't have one of those, it's D.
Mm-hmm.
So A is ash, B is boil, C is computer, K is kitchen. There you go.
Yeah, because when you're talking ash, that's the result of, that's what's left of
wood, paper,
the combustion. But these are the different, liquids. And you'll notice now that you've seen this and you'll memorize it. Now I don't know if it happens to you, but every fire extinguisher I see everywhere I go now, I look at and see what kind of fire extinguisher it is.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost all ABCs. Most of them are not Ds because that's a special kind of fire. But you normally don't have combustible metals in most buildings, right? If you're that kind of business, then you'd have a separate fire extinguisher for that. Those are the different. You'll need to memorize this. The different types of fires. K is just kitchen.
Can I say that one more time?
A is ash, B is boil, C is computer, K is kitchen. And if it's not one of those, it's D.
Yep, that's good. So yeah, always consult local fire code. You know, that's your number one guidance. You know, and that's another thing you'll see in the exam. You'll be given options on what to do about certain things, and sometimes you'll see one of the options is to consult an expert. Consult the fire marshal. You know, consult a specialist. That's going to be your answer.
What's the proper type of fire extinguisher to put in to meet building code? Do the research online, or consult an expert.
Yeah, consult the expert.
Consult an expert.
Yep. So here are the 4 methods that the fire suppression works: reducing the temperature of the fire, the supply of oxygen, the supply of fuel, or the chemical reaction. And that kind of goes along with this ABCD. So water is one way that would lower the temperature. It also starves a little bit of oxygen, and it also reduces the chemical reaction that happens in a combustion, right? It's oxygen with carbon or whatever the hell. But it does disrupt that too. But water, you know, we wouldn't use that in an electrical fire because we'll get electrocuted. Soda acid, this is what soda acid fire extinguishers used to look like, right? Dry powder, CO2. We don't like CO2 in any place where there's ever going to be a human being because CO2 kills people. Right? It starves, the way it works is it starves the oxygen in the, so if a CO2 went off right now, we would all suffocate. Right? So normally you put CO2 out in remote areas, remote data centers where there isn't anybody there, and there won't be anybody there for a while or whatever. And so a fire flares up there and you just shoot it with CO2 and the fire is out. So those kind of applications for CO2. But yeah. We don't put CO2 in many places. Halon used to be really popular, but then we realized it depleted the ozone layer. So now, you know, the Montreal Accord came out and said no more halon. There's a lot of money in the people that invested in halon fire suppression and other things. So they had to make some. You could like for a while you could use recycled halon and whatever else, but now everything is pretty much changed over to argon. Fe13, FM200 is probably the most common that I see. You can see FM200, they got the big red tanks in the data center, and you've got the unique heads with the brass, you know, looks like a cone coming out. Those are almost always FM200. Yeah, so halon has been replaced. You'll need to know that these are the replacements for halon. Sprinkler systems, wet pipe, water is in the pipe. And as soon as something triggers, typically it's the valve on the sprinkler head itself. It melts at certain temperatures depending on which kind of valve I have or which kind of valve insert. But there's already water in there, and as soon as that melts, the water comes out. We wouldn't run these outside in Minnesota, right? They'll freeze, and we'll get water all over the place. So not a good application there. This is actually the most common type of fire suppression in data centers today. Taking all data centers, it would be wet pipe because it is very effective. But it seems kind of weird, doesn't it? Because you've got a computer, so much computer equipment in there. These are the bulbs. So if you look at that one, I think that one looks like it's red. So that one would melt at 155 degrees. I don't know if you need to memorize that stuff, but I think it's pretty interesting because when you look at fire sprinklers, you'll be like, oh, that one melts at 155, or that one melts at 175, or whatever. It's kind of cool. Pre-action. Pre-action means something's got to happen. Usually these, there's two triggers. So something fills, so they're dry. Something happens, and release of air. So you can hear a pre-action when it goes off, because it's pushing the air out. The water is pushing the air out to fill the valve, and then that second action happens, which is typically the release of the sprinkler valve itself, right? That melting piece. So there's one action, maybe a fire, maybe a smoke detector or something triggers that first action, which is to fill the pipe, and then the second thing happens, it melts, and then it all goes, right? That's a pre-action. Usually the pre-action dry pipe. There's other types of pre-action, but the one I just explained is called a pre-action dry pipe. Portable fire extinguishers, remember the pass, pull the pin, aim low, squeeze the pin, sweep the fire. That's how you use the pass system with portable fire extinguishers, and thank God. Sorry, I'm a half hour late. I did not expect it to take that long.
You will need to know the different types of sprinkler systems, and they'll give you a scenario, and you have to pick the right one.
But it's Thursday. You guys have Friday and the whole weekend to party? You guys party? Huh? Party like security guys? We sleep?
Maybe after this class, yeah, one party.
You guys did good today.